Guys, welcome back to the Zero Code to App Store tutorial. And today we're gonna discuss how to write some code. So we're gonna learn some coding concepts. So one of the coding concepts that I want to discuss today is view controllers. You keep on seeing view controllers a lot in iOS. And this is a view controller. As you can see, this screen itself is a view controller because a view controller is basically an entity in an app that controls the views. Basically, the view controller together a view and a controller, and you can see that it uses it's a UI view controller that Apple wrote. And what we're doing is we actually can say self.view because there's a view connected to that view controller. So the way that it is this itself is the whole thing is a view controller. If you click on here, and if you click on this one, which is like kind of like a newspaper, it says view controller, right? So that's a view controller, and if I click here, I see that's a view. So it has a view, and that view is what we're working on. If I were to delete this view, then I don't have the view anymore. I just have the view controller. See? Command Z it, and now we can get the view back. And now I have the view. So that's how it is. So we're gonna write some code. We're gonna say we want to change the background of the view controller, the view, right, to a red. So we say just view, and the reason I'm doing this inside something called view.load is because it's calling this whenever the view has loaded. So whenever the view has loaded, the first thing that it basically executes is this one, this line of code. So it says view the background color, go $red, just like that. Just go ahead, follow my instruction. We'll talk about coding later, but just follow my. I'm just gonna change the view's background color to red, and we're gonna run it. And that should change the view's background color to red. Remember you talked about the inspector, the property inspector. So you have the property inspector. See, it's red. So I can change it to blue if I wanted to, or something. So I'm doing the same thing that I'm doing inside the storyboard, where I was going, remember I was going in storyboard, and I was going here to the view, clicking on the view, I was clicking on the inspector, and I was changing it to a background color too. So I said I could do anything in code, and I'm doing it in code. So that's your first line of code. Alright, so what I want to discuss next is Swift. So we're going to do click on File, click on New, and click on Playgrounds. And just go ahead and click on New Playgrounds, and we're going to go ahead and just open a new playground. You can just name it To-Do List, and just click Create. Alright, so what Swift is a programming language that we discussed what programming languages are. And Apple, this import UI kit means that Apple is basically giving us all the code we need to write. So we don't need to write every code. Like there's all this code written for us that we can use. Because if we were to write all that code ourselves, it's going to be a lot of code. So Apple gives us this framework called the UI kit. It's called a User Interface Kit. It's basically a software development kit. It's like a kit that is given to us, and we can use it to write code. And it has everything that iOS has. Like like you have basically the iPhone, and all the iPhone has all controls and everything. And everything that I need to develop for that iPhone is in that UI kit. And now I have something called var str is hello playground. So let me go ahead and just fill this out. It doesn't bother me again. This is actually it just tells me that you give access to debugging. Alright, so we have something that says var. Anything starts with a var keyword means that I can rewrite on it. So remember we said this is a address in memory. So this str creates an address in memory and assigns this string to it, a letter to it. String is basically a series of characters. So if I were to have just one character, it's one character. If I have series of characters, I have series of characters. If I have one character, I do like this in Swift, and it's a character. But if I have series, it's a quotation mark. It's single quotation mark for character and double quotation mark for string, which is a string is series of characters. And what var is that I'm assigning it to an address in memory. Remember we discussed address in memory when we did the drawings. So we have address in memory, and I can create another var. But the thing with var, there's var and there's a let. What's the difference between var and let? I can write the same thing and say a let, and I'll just copy it, Command C, and then Command V. So var and let, and then there is also, so those are the two things that you need to know, var and let. What var is basically, now I can go ahead and change that address in memory to a different address, and I can just say str equals hello. So what does that mean is I'm changing that. So I have the same address in memory, but I'm changing what it's assigned to, you know, because it's var. But if I were to, so I need to change this to a different name, because it won't, you can't reuse the name, but you only can reuse the name if you were to override it. So I'm overriding this variable to hello. I can override it again. I can overwrite the same thing again and say like that. I can overwrite several times. And then, but str1 I cannot overwrite because it's something called constant, and it's not mutable. Mutable means it cannot be changed. Whatever you create remains created. So you cannot overwrite it anymore. So I can't overwrite this to, like, say this. Why? Because it's a constant. I can't change constants. So it's a good practice as a programmer to always write let and not use too much var, because you're using more memory that way, you know. So that's what it is. So that's a kind of brief description on var. And then there's different kind of vars. So what I'm saying is there's different type of variables. So we talked about strings, which are series of characters, right? And then we have also integers, so like any kind of whole numbers or integers. So there's int, and that's whole numbers. And then there is floats, which is we're gonna have some example on that. Float is basically digits. So this is 2 digits, floating numbers they call it. 2 digits, precision, floating numbers. And then there is something called double, actually a single digit. So this is also a floating number, but it's a 2 digit. So there's more precision on a double than a float. And there's actually I can show you the memory that's being used in those things. So it's float, double. Okay, so, and you can see that there's all this. So you have a float, which is 32, is 7 digits, and then the double, which is 64 bits, and decimal, which is 128 bits. And it uses how much memory. So I'll tell you the memory things for it. Memory. Alright, so basically what happens is if you have a float, it's like that, and double, and it uses so the maximum is, so let me get the maximum for that is max float. All right, so basically the maximum in Swift is they have a table, but we can also get it from the thing. So it tells you here 3.4 something to, so the float is 3.4, float 32, which is 32 bits, the 3.4 to the 8, and then 64 is this. So this much decimal number, so you can use at that much decimal when you use that variable, that data type. It's called data type. And then you have double, which is even bigger, and then you have integer. Integer is basically the maximum integer is still a large number, and then you have an 8-bit, which is only 128, and then 16-bit, which is 32,767, and then 3264, and then unsigned int is basically anything that's not negative. Unsigned doesn't have a negative or positive. Integer just has a, you know, it has sign. So remember, it doesn't have negative, but this includes negative to positive. And what 32-bit and 64-bit means is there's 32-bit computer. So remember we talked about CPU. So you have 32-bit CPU and a 64, but most computers nowadays are 64, and even your iPhone is 64. So it actually abides to those rules that I showed you right now. So let's go back to our playground. Okay, so here's my playground. So in order to declare those kind of variables, so if we have like an int, so we have a number, so we can still use var let. It's the same thing. We just say number. We can say anything we want. So this is the second part of this, tells you what signature you put on it. You know, like basically you declare a name for it. For every variable has a name. So these variables that we create. And so I say number 3. Okay, so that's an integer. And then if I go and say number 2, so float, let's do a float, right? Floating number, and that's 3.2, like that. And then if we have a double number, so it's more precision. Actually, what I can do in Swift is I can tell it what kind of type it is. So if it's integer, I can say, actually in Swift you put int with capital I. Remember we looked at int 832, so it's, remember, 8 bits, 16-bit, 32-bit, 64-bit. But it just has more value. So if you want bigger memory, like if you have like a huge number, then you use 64, but usually most of the time you just use int. And then this one you use a float. You don't have to specify. Usually Swift knows what type it is. And then this one is a double. You just go double. So another type is Boolean. So what that Boolean means is if a true or false. So I can have is false, false. And you can again, if you put a colon and false, I have to say lowercase false. I'm sorry, not false, Boolean. Bool, lower uppercase bool. So if we do that, then basically that's a Boolean. So you have so let's review it. We've learned about what variables are, their address in memory, and there's two variables. There's one that is constant, which starts with a let. There's one that you can override, which is mutable, they call it, because you can change it, and that starts with a var. Most time you want to use lets. And then you can assign a data type to each variable. So these are variables. These are variables because you create an address in memory. And then you assign a number to it. You assign a value to that address. And you assign a type. And the type is an integer, a float, a double, or a bool. There's other types too, but you don't need to know because we're gonna have arrays and we're gonna have tuples. There's other types that we're gonna learn it later. For now, this is the most basic type that you should know. All right, so this concludes this part of the thing. So what we're gonna do next is we're gonna start learning about functions and loops, and then we're gonna learn about classes, and then we're gonna get down to starting our to-do list app. Thank you.